The brass key sat in the center of Nora Tatum's calloused palm like a dead thing, jagged, heavy, old as a creek stone in February. A skin of green oxidation clung to it, the kind of corrosion that comes from 40 years of waiting in the dark for someone to remember it existed. She closed her hand around it slowly, not to hide it, to feel the weight of what her bachelor uncle had thought she was worth. Across the polished walnut table of Holbrook and Vance estate attorneys, the laughter started small. A snort from cousin Beatrice Pemberton, a choked breath from her husband. Then it rolled outward, soft and ugly, the way laughter does, when wealthy people pretend they're trying to hold it back. Beatrice adjusted the silk scarf at her throat. She had just been bequeathed $4.2 million in blue-chip securities and a 70-acre equestrian estate outside Lexington, Kentucky. She was tasting the win. "Well now," Beatrice said, her voice cut from old Tennessee money, but sharpened in a Memphis finishing school. "Isn't that just like Uncle Perce? He always did have a sense of humor about you, Nora. A grease monkey gets a heap of grease." The laughter rose another notch. Nora did not move. She kept her eyes on the brass key. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Knoxville Law Office, a gray October rain ran down the glass in long, crooked lines, the kind of rain that gets inside your bones and stays there until April. The walnut table reflected the overhead lights like still water. Somewhere a clock ticked. Somewhere a heating vent sighed. Wallace Holbrook cleared his throat at the head of the table. I was a tall man, silver at the temples, a face built for closing arguments and oil portraits, 68 years old. The kind of lawyer who had outlived 3 governors and buried 2 wives. His suit was charcoal. His tie was burgundy, and his cufflinks were the small gold anchors of a man who wanted you to know he had earned every quiet thing he owned. He looked at Nora over the rims of his glasses, and for 1/2 second something flickered behind his eyes that had nothing to do with sympathy. "Mrs. Tatum," he said, "your late great-uncle Percival was very specific. To you, he leaves the deed to the parcel known as the Hollow Creek Barn, located on the southern boundary of the Cumberland property, together with its sole contents. To wit, a 1958 Plymouth Belvedere." He let that sit. He let her listen to the room breathe. "The remainder of the estate," he went on, "the Lockheed pension, the offshore holdings, the residential properties, and the securities portfolio are distributed among the named cousins as detailed in the schedule before you. The Hollow Creek parcel must be vacated and the structure cleared within 30 days. A development firm has already purchased the surrounding acreage. After that window, anything left on the lot becomes the property of the buyer." He folded his hands. "I would suggest Mrs. Tatum a scrapyard. I'm told they pay by the pound." Beatrice laughed again, openly this time. Nora finally looked up. She did not look at Beatrice. She did not look at the cousins. She looked at Wallace Holbrook, dead level, the way a mechanic looks at a leak she cannot yet see but can already smell. 30 days, she said. 30 days. And you're the executor. I am. And you'd like me to take the $200 and walk. Holbrook smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has asked an inconvenient question. I'd like you, Mrs. Tatum, to do what is best for your situation. I understand your daughter is unwell. I understand the medical bills. The estate cannot legally accelerate distribution, but I can personally offer to facilitate a buyer for the barn parcel and its contents, a flat $50,000 cash by Friday. That would clear your debts considerably. The table went quiet. $50,000 for a rusted barn and a rotted car was not a kindness. It was not even a gesture. It was a number a man names when he is afraid of a different number. And Nora Tatum had spent 22 years under the hoods of other people's machines, learning the difference between a man being generous and a man being nervous. She slid the brass key into the front pocket of her work jacket. I'll think on it, she said. She stood up. She did not shake anyone's hand. She walked out of the conference room of Holbrook and Vance with her boots loud on the marble floor, and the laughter dying behind her like a fire someone had forgotten to feed. In the elevator, she watched her own reflection in the brushed steel. 38 years old, dark hair pulled back in a working braid, a jaw she had inherited from her father, and a stillness she had inherited from her mother. A canvas Carhartt jacket over a flannel shirt, both clean that morning, both already smelling faintly of the shop. There was grease under the half moon of her left thumbnail that no soap on earth was going to lift. She did not cry in the elevator. She had used up all of that 3 years ago in a different building, in a different kind of room, with a state trooper standing in front of her, holding his hat in both hands. She had used up the rest of it last Tuesday. Last Tuesday was when Dr. Halverson at Vanderbilt Children's had sat down across from her in a quiet office and said the words that Nora had been hearing in her sleep for 2 years. Mrs. Tatum, we are going to need to talk about a 4th surgery. Wren had been born with a heart that was almost right. Almost. Faulty valve, a chamber the wrong size, a rhythm that wandered when it should have marched. 3 surgeries in 7 years. 3 times Nora had sat in a waiting room with vending machine coffee turning to acid in her stomach. 3 times she had watched a nurse push a small gurney through a pair of doors that said, "Authorized personnel only." The 4th surgery was $180,000. The hospital had been patient. The hospital had been kind. The hospital was also a business, and the business office had stopped sending letters and started sending people who said the word options the way other people said the word lawsuit. Without the 4th surgery, Dr. Halverson had said 8 months. Maybe 10 if they were lucky and the weather stayed mild. 8 months. Nora got into her Ford F-150, 12 years old, 240,000 miles on the odometer, and sat with her hands on the steering wheel and her forehead resting against the cold leather. She did not start the engine. She just listened to the rain on the roof of the cab and tried to breathe in a way that did not feel like swallowing gravel. In her jacket pocket, the brass key pressed against her hip bone, like a question she had not yet decided whether to answer. The drive from Knoxville back to Hollow Creek took an hour and 20 minutes on a good day. This was not a good day. The rain followed her west along Interstate 40, then south on a state highway that wound up into the Cumberland Plateau, past tobacco barns leaning at apologetic angles and gas stations that sold live bait and lottery tickets out of the same cooler. Hollow Creek was not a town so much as a stretch of road. A volunteer fire department, a diner called May's that had been called May's since before the second May died, a feed store, a Methodist church with white siding and a cemetery older than the state. Population by the most recent sign was 412, and Nora suspected the sign had not been updated since the last time she had personally added one to the count. Her shop sat on the eastern edge of town. Tatum and Son, Auto and Welding, the sign still said, though Tatum the elder was 20 years gone, and the son had never existed. Her father had bought the sign at an estate auction in 1991 and had never gotten around to repainting it. Nora had been planning to repaint it for 16 years. She did not stop at the shop today. She drove past it, past the diner, past the church, and out along Cumberland Loop Road, where the asphalt thinned and the trees closed in. Loblolly pine and white oak and yellow poplar, all of them shedding their last colors in the rain. The road climbed, the road narrowed, the road became gravel. And then 4 miles past the last mailbox, a muddy tractor path peeled off to the right between 2 leaning fence posts, and Nora turned the truck onto it. She had not been to her uncle's barn in 14 years. The path ran a 1/4 mile through second growth pine before it opened onto a clearing, and there it stood. A long, low cedar plank barn with a sagging tin roof, a structure that had been losing an argument with gravity since the Reagan administration. The big sliding door at the front was secured with a chain and a heavy iron padlock, both of them flowering with rust. Beyond the barn, 1/2 mile up a rise, the Victorian farmhouse where her uncle had lived for the last 40 years of his life sat in a pool of leaden afternoon light. White painted, 2 stories. A wraparound porch with a single rocker on it. Her uncle had built that rocker himself out of a fallen sweet gum. It was still there. Nobody had thought to take it inside. Nora killed the engine. For a long time, she just sat in the cab and looked at the barn through the rain-streaked windshield. Her hand was inside her jacket pocket, and her fingers were closed around the brass key, and she was trying to talk herself out of crying for the second time in a week. She was thinking about a summer day when she was 9 years old. It had been hot, the kind of August heat that made the air shimmer above the gravel. Beatrice and the other cousins had been at the country club pool in Knoxville. Nora's parents had needed a place to put her. Her uncle had said, "Send her up to the creek. I'll give her something to do." That summer, Percival Tatum had taught her to weld. He had stood her on an overturned milk crate so she could see over the work table. He had wrapped her small hands inside his enormous leather gloves. He had lowered the welding hood over her head and held her wrists steady. And he had said into her ear in his low gravel voice, "Men build airplanes, Nora. Women like you build whole worlds of their own. You remember that." She had been 9. She had not understood it then. She thought she was beginning to. Nora opened the truck door. She walked to the bed and unhooked the toolbox. She took out a pair of heavy bolt cutters, a flashlight, and the iron crowbar that had belonged to her father. She walked through the wet weeds to the barn door. She set the bolt cutters on the chain. She squeezed. The chain dropped to the mud. The big sliding door gave a low, exhausted groan, and she pulled it back along its rusted track as feet 8 feet 10 feet, until the gray afternoon light spilled into the dark of the barn for the first time in what felt like 100 years. And there it was. The 1958 Plymouth Belvedere sat in the center of the dirt floor, exactly where the lawyer's letter had said it would be. It was a tragedy. The chrome of the bumpers had blistered into a pox of pitting and flake. The famous tail fins were dented inward on the driver's side, as if something heavy had been dropped onto the rear quarter a long time ago. The paint, whatever it had originally been, was now the dull red-brown of an old wound. The tires were flat and rotting off their rims. The windshield was a spiderweb of fractures held together by nothing but the memory of glass. Rat droppings on the hood. The unmistakable ammoniac sourness of raccoon. A film of dust thick enough to write your name in. Nora walked a slow circle around the car. She did not say anything. She did not curse her uncle. She did not kick the tire. She walked. She had been a mechanic for 22 years, and she had been Percival Tatum's apprentice for 10 of those summers. And she knew what she was looking at and what she was not looking at. What she was looking at was a car that had been deliberately abandoned. What she was not looking at was a car that had been forgotten. There was a difference, and the difference was in the small things. The lug nuts on all 4 wheels were not original. They had been replaced, and the replacements had been seated with a torque wrench, not an impact gun. The hood was closed, but not latched, which meant somebody had been under it last and had wanted to be able to lift it again quickly. The door handle on the driver's side, when she touched it with one gloved finger, did not stick. The pivot was greased, recently greased. She crouched beside the front tire and ran her hand along the underside of the front fender. Beneath the rust, she felt seam sealer. Fresh seam sealer. Maybe 10 years old, maybe 15, but laid down in a careful professional bead. The way you would lay it down if you were planning for the body of a car to last. Her uncle had not stopped working on this car. He had only stopped letting it be seen. Nora stood up slowly. The rain was tapping on the tin roof above her, a soft, uneven percussion, and the gray light through the doorway lit the side of the Plymouth like a sick face. "All right, Perce," she said quietly to nobody. "All right, I'm looking." She tried the driver's door. It opened, smoothly, without complaint. The hinge had been packed with fresh grease, the kind of grease nobody bothers to apply to a car they have given up on. The smell that came out of the cabin was old mildew and ancient leather and something else. something faint and metallic that Nora knew from the shop, the iron smell of welded steel that has not yet been painted over. She slid behind the wheel. The seat groaned under her weight. The springs were shot. The headliner sagged. The radio was missing, leaving a rectangular hole in the dash where the wires had been clipped clean and capped with electrical tape. The steering wheel was wrapped in tape that had once been black and was now the color of dirty bone. Nora set the flashlight on the dashboard and angled it down. She pulled the rotted wool carpet back from the passenger side floor, and there it was. The thing she had felt without seeing the moment she opened the door. The thing she had known was there the way a person knows a room is about to be entered by someone who loves them. The passenger side floor pan was 3 inches higher than the driver's side. It was not warped. It was not collapsed. It had been raised deliberately with a plate of heavy-gauge steel set down on top of the original pan, and the seam, where the new steel met the body of the car, had been welded. Nora leaned in close. She moved the flashlight along the joint. The weld was a perfect uniform stack of dimes. Tungsten inert gas. The kind of weld you get from a man with a steady hand, a clean argon flow, and 40 years of practice. The kind of weld they used in the wings of the SR-71 Blackbird, which her uncle had quietly worked on in the late 70s and had never once in his entire life bragged about. At the 4 corners of the plate, 4 bolts. She got down on her hands and knees in the cabin and put the light right on them. They were titanium. They were not hex. They were not Torx. They were a 6-pointed star with a center pin, a tamper-proof drive pattern that you could not buy at the hardware store in Knoxville, and could not have bought there in 1985 either. Aerospace, fasteners, military spec. Nora sat back on her heels. Her breath was coming faster than it should have been. She was not a woman who frightened easily, and she was not a woman who got excited easily, and she did not know yet which of those 2 things she was feeling. Maybe both. She knew one thing. Whatever was under this plate, her uncle had not put it there to forget about it. He had put it there to keep it. And he had built the cage in such a way that only a person who knew what they were looking at could even begin to open it. I had built the cage for her. She got out of the car. She closed the door gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping person, and she walked back out into the rain, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of the barn and looked up at the gray sky and laughed once. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has just understood something she did not want to understand, and who knows that the understanding is now going to cost her. She drove back to town. She did not go home. She went to the shop. She unlocked the side door and turned on the overhead fluorescents and walked through the smell of cutting oil and old tire rubber to the cabinet at the back where she kept the things she rarely used. From the bottom drawer, she took out a brand new metal cutting disc still in its sleeve. From the top drawer, she took out a portable halogen work light and a 50-foot extension cord. From the corner, she took the small Honda generator that she used at job sites when there was no power. She loaded the truck. She drove home, and she stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, and she watched Ren sleep. Ren slept the way only 7-year-olds with bad hearts can sleep, which is hard with one fist closed and the other open. Her dark hair was tangled across the pillow. A stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to Nora's mother was tucked under her chin. On the bedside table, the small white pulse oximeter that Ren wore at night when her oxygen ran low sat dark and quiet, which meant a good night. 8 months. Nora stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not go in. She did not want to wake the child. She just stood there, and she made a decision in the dark. And the decision was the kind of decision a mother makes once and never unmakes. Whatever her uncle had buried under that floor pan, it was going to pay for the surgery that was going to save her daughter's life. Anything else it was Nora would deal with after. She closed the door softly. She went back out to the truck. 6 hours later, in the dark belly of the Hollow Creek barn, Nora Tatum knelt beside the open passenger door of the 1958 Plymouth Belvedere with the DeWalt angle grinder screaming in her hands. Sparks fountained up from the first titanium bolt. They lit the barn in jumping orange light. They bounced off the rotted seats. They danced across the cracked windshield. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the only sounds in the world were the shriek of the grinder, the chug of the little Honda generator on the dirt floor, and the steady, slow hammering of Nora's heart inside her ribs. The first bolt took 20 minutes and a fresh disc. The second bolt took 25 and a second fresh disc. The third took longer because her arms were beginning to shake. The fourth she did with her teeth set and the sweat running into her eyes, and when the head sheared off and the bolt skittered across the floor pan, she dropped the grinder onto the seat beside her and just leaned her forehead against the steel of the doorframe and breathed. She was wet through with sweat. Her shoulders burned. Her wrists were 2 knots of fire. The barn smelled of hot metal and ozone and the burned rubber smell of grinding discs at their limit. She picked up the crowbar. She wedged it under the edge of the steel plate. She put her boot against the transmission tunnel, and she pushed with both arms and all of her weight, and for a long, terrible second, the plate did not move, and she thought, "Oh God, there is another layer. There is another seal. I am not going to be able to do this alone in one night." And then it moved. A low metallic complaint, a sucking pop, as the rubber gasket beneath the plate gave up its 40-year vacuum and the heavy steel sheet lifted up out of the floor. Nora pulled it free. She set it on the dirt outside the car. She came back and she picked up the work light and she pointed it down into the hole. The cavity was lined with sheet lead. Lead, 40 years old, dull and gray, fitted to the contours of the compartment with the precision of a coffin maker. Lead was what you used to shield something from X-rays. Lead was what you used when you were hiding from people who could see through walls. Resting inside the lead-lined compartment was a military munitions box. It was olive drab. It was sealed with a heavy rubber gasket along the lid. It had a faded white stencil along one side that read, in block letters, "Property of U.S. Army," and beneath that, in smaller hand stenciled black, a single word that her uncle had added himself. Custody, not property. Custody. Nora reached down. She got both gloved hands on the iron carry handles. She lifted, and her shoulders screamed at her, and she swore under her breath, and she dragged the box up over the lip of the compartment and across the passenger seat and out of the car. It hit the dirt floor of the barn with a heavy, satisfying thump. She knelt beside it. She wiped the sweat from her eyes with the back of her wrist. The two latches on the front were heavy steel, the kind with a safety hook to keep them from rattling open in transport. She flipped the first hook. She thumbed the first latch. It opened with a clean metallic click that seemed to echo across the entire dark barn. She flipped the second hook. She thumbed the second latch. She put her hands on the lid. For a moment, she did not lift it. She just rested her hands there and felt the cold steel against her palms. And she thought very clearly, this is the last second of your old life. The next breath you take is going to be in a different country. She lifted the lid. The light from the halogen work lamp fell into the box and Nora Tatum stopped breathing. The interior was divided into 3 padded compartments. In the first compartment, wrapped in clear sleeves of acid-free plastic, were stacks of paper. She knew what they were the moment she saw them. Her father had owned a single one when she was a child, mounted in a frame on the wall of his office. United States Treasury Bearer Bonds. Issued 1982. $10,000 face value each. There were not dozens, there were hundreds, stacked, banded, cataloged. Each band marked in her uncle's tiny, precise handwriting, with a date and a serial range. Bearer bonds had not been issued since 1982, precisely because they were untraceable. Whoever held them owned them. There was no name on them. There was no record of ownership. They were as good as cash, and they were worth by the rough math Nora did in her head and refused to finish somewhere north of $7 million. She did not let herself think about that yet. She moved her eyes to the second compartment. 6 small pouches of dark blue velvet, drawstring tops, each pouch the size of her fist. She picked up the first one. The weight of it surprised her. She loosened the drawstring with shaking fingers and tipped the contents into her gloved palm. A watch slid out. It was gold. It was heavy. The crown logo on the face caught the halogen light and threw it back, and Nora, who had been around enough wealthy customers in 22 years of fixing their German cars to know one thing about timepieces, recognized what she was holding. A Rolex Daytona. Vintage. The dial said Paul Newman in small block letters under the maker's mark. She had seen one of these once at an auction house in Nashville. A customer had asked her to ride along to look at a car. She remembered the auctioneer saying in a quiet voice that the Paul Newman Daytona on the block that night was expected to fetch over $1 million at Hammer. She was holding one in her hand. She put it down very carefully on the lid of the box. She opened the next pouch. A Patek Philippe. She did not know the reference number, but she knew the brand, and she knew that Patek Philippe's of any vintage did not come out of barns in Tennessee. She did not open the others. She didn't have to. The shape of the night had already changed, and she could feel it changing the way the barometric pressure changes before a storm. She moved her eyes to the third compartment. At the bottom of the box, resting in a fitted velvet cradle, was a single black leather-bound ledger. The cover was unmarked, except for one small embossed crest in the lower right corner, gold leaf gone matte with age. A shield, a pair of crossed keys, the crest of Pictet et Cie, the private Swiss bank that had handled the quiet money of European royalty for 200 years. Sitting on top of the ledger was a sealed envelope. The envelope was cream-colored. The seal was a circle of dark red wax pressed with a signet she had seen on her uncle's small finger every Christmas of her life. And across the front of the envelope, in the sharp, precise handwriting that Nora had known since she was 9 years old, standing on a milk crate in this very building, was a single word. Nora. She picked up the envelope. She broke the wax seal. The paper inside was thick and slightly yellowed. The handwriting was steady. The date in the upper right corner was 3 months before her uncle had died. She read, "My Nora, if you are reading this, it means you ignored the lawyer. It means you did not sell the Plymouth to a scrapyard. It means you went into the barn yourself and you knew enough to know what you were looking at when you saw it. I always told you that you were the only one in this family with hands that thought for themselves. I am proud of you, child. I am sorrier than you can know. The money in this box is yours. It is enough to save your daughter. It is enough to bury me well. It is enough to walk away from this miserable family and never need any of them again, and I want you to do exactly that. But I have to tell you the truth about it, because you have earned the truth, and because if I do not tell you the truth, will come for you anyway, and it will come fast. I did not earn this money as an engineer. I came into possession of it during an operation in Berlin in the autumn of 1983. The bonds and the watches were part of a payment. The payment was meant to buy my silence about a thing I had seen and a thing I had been told to allow to happen, and a thing I instead chose to interrupt. I have lived with what I did and what I did not do every day since. There is a ledger in this box. The ledger is what they have been looking for 40 years. They believed I destroyed it. I let them believe it. I did not destroy it because I needed to know that if they ever came back, I could put them in the ground with it. I never had the courage to use it. You will. Take the bonds. Take the watches. Liquidate them quietly through the contacts I have written on the first page of the ledger. They are old men now, but they remember me, and they will remember you when you say my name. Pay for Ren's surgery. Pay off the house. Walk away clean. And then, child, if you have it in you, I am asking you one last thing. Burn the ledger. Burn it in the wood stove in my kitchen, and do not open it first. Unless you find that you cannot live without knowing what your old uncle was so afraid of. In which case, Nora, and only in which case, turn to page 47. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you more than I ever managed to say. Purse. Nora let the letter fall to her lap. The barn was very quiet. The generator chugged. The work light hummed. Somewhere out in the wet woods, an owl called once long and low, and was answered by nothing. She sat there on the dirt floor of her dead uncle's barn with a fortune in her lap and a question in her hand. And she thought about her daughter sleeping with the stuffed rabbit under her chin. And she thought about a $50,000 offer from a man in a charcoal suit who had been a little too eager to drive out to the Cumberland Plateau in person on a rainy October afternoon. A man who had said by the pound. A man who had been very specific about 30 days. Nora Tatum was not a foolish woman. She had been told by her uncle plainly in his own steady hand to burn the ledger unread. She picked up the ledger. She held it in her lap for a long minute. She could feel the weight of it, the way the leather had warmed under her hands, the small gold crest catching the light. She thought about Wallace Holbrook's eyes flickering for that half second across the conference table this morning when he had read out the address of the barn. She thought about her uncle's last sentence. Unless you find that you cannot live without knowing what your old uncle was so afraid of. Her hand moved by itself. She opened the ledger. She turned past page 1, where a list of names in her uncle's handwriting weighted the contacts he had promised 10 names in 10 different cities. She turned past page 10, past page 20, past page 30. Her thumb found page 47. She lifted it. She looked down, and every drop of blood in Nora Tatum's body went cold. There were 3 names on page 47 written in her uncle's careful hand, each followed by a paragraph of dates and dollar figures and bank account numbers and the small notation in red ink of an action taken or an action allowed. The first name on the list, written at the very top of the page in letters slightly larger than the others, was a name she had heard for the first time only that morning, sitting across a polished walnut table in a Knoxville law office, while a room full of her cousins laughed at her. Wallace J. Holbrook, Junior Liaison Officer, U.S. Diplomatic Mission, West Berlin, 1981 to 1984. Nora read the paragraph beneath the name. She read it twice. Outside the barn, very far away down the muddy tractor path, a pair of headlights swung off Cumberland Loop Road and turned in. The headlights swung up the tractor path slow and deliberate, the way a hunter walks the last 100 yards toward a deer he has already decided is dead. Nora Tatum did not move at first. She was still on her knees in the dirt of the barn, the open ledger across her thighs, the work light hot on her face. Page 47 lay in her lap like a verdict. Wallace J. Holbrook, Junior Liaison Officer, West Berlin, 1981 to 1984. Below the name in her uncle's narrow surgical hand were 3 short paragraphs that ended a man's life if anyone with a federal badge ever read them. Outside, the headlights kept coming. She heard the engine before she saw the shape of it. Heavy. Diesel. Not a farm truck. Not a county vehicle. A throaty, expensive growl, well maintained, of a kind she did not hear in Hollow Creek. Then a second engine behind the first, a matched twin. And 2 of them. Nora moved. She closed the ledger. She unzipped the front of her work jacket and shoved the ledger flat against her ribs and zipped the jacket back up to her chin. She lifted the lid of the munitions box and closed it. She flipped both latches. She grabbed the iron carry handles and hauled the box up off the dirt floor in one heaving lurch that pulled something in her lower back she would feel for a week. Out through the open barn door, across the wet weeds. The 2 pairs of headlights were halfway up the tractor path, now slowing for the bend. She heaved the box into the bed of the F-150 and dropped a tarp over it and threw the toolbox on top of the tarp and a coil of chain on top of the toolbox. Then she stepped back to the barn door, killed the generator with a slap at the kill switch, killed the work light, and pulled the big sliding door shut along its rusted track. She did not have time to relock the chain. She left it lying in the mud and walked back to the truck at the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who is not in a hurry. Because a woman who is in a hurry is a woman with something to hide. She slid behind the wheel. She turned the key. The Ford's V8 caught on the first crank the way it always did. A sound she knew the way another woman knows her husband's laugh. She left the lights off. She let the truck idle. The first SUV crested the rise and rolled into the clearing in front of the barn. It was a Chevrolet Suburban. Matte black, tinted windows. No plate on the front, which in Tennessee meant the rear plate was the only plate, and the rear plate would be a fleet number. Behind it, the second Suburban rolled up and stopped at a 45-degree angle, the way a second vehicle stops when its job is to block a retreat. 4 doors opened on the lead truck. 4 men stepped out into the wet grass. They were not from Hollow Creek. They were not from Knoxville. They moved in a way that the men of Hollow Creek did not move, with their hands a little too loose at their sides, their feet a little too quiet in the wet, their eyes already scanning the tree line before their boots had finished touching the ground. One of them pulled a pair of long bolt cutters from inside the cab. Another walked straight to the barn door. He saw the broken chain in the mud. He turned his head sharply and said something to the man with the bolt cutters that Nora did not hear. Nora dropped the F-150 into drive. She did not floor it. She rolled, headlights off, slow. The truck moved out from behind the cedar shed where she had parked it, eased across the wet grass at the back of the clearing, and slid into the mouth of an old logging trail that ran north along the creek. Her father had cut that trail when she was 11. Her uncle had hauled cordwood out of it for 30 years. Nora knew every root in it, every soft place, every overhanging branch. The men at the barn did not see her for the first 100 yards. Then one of them did. A shout went up. The bolt cutters hit the ground. Boots scrambled on wet metal. Doors slammed. The two black Suburbans roared to life and lurched after her in a spray of mud, and Nora Tatum hit her headlights and floored the accelerator and went. The chase was short and brutal and only half a chase. The Suburbans were heavier, more powerful, and better armored. On a paved road, they would have run her down inside a mile. But the logging trail did not care about armor. The logging trail cared about ground clearance and about a driver who knew where the washouts were. And Nora knew where the washouts were because she had ridden her bicycle over them when she was 12, and she had pulled her uncle's pickup out of one of them when she was 17. She took the first washout at 35 miles an hour with her teeth clenched. The F-150 bucked. The toolbox jumped. The tarp lifted and slammed back down. Behind her, the first Suburban hit the same washout at 40. And Nora saw in her rearview mirror the way its front end pitched and the way its rear end fishtailed before the driver overcorrected and put the right front wheel into the soft shoulder. The Suburban did not roll. It just stopped, hard, up to the rocker panel in mud and pine needles. The second Suburban swerved to avoid the first and did not quite make it. It clipped the rear quarter of the lead truck with a metallic clap that Nora heard even over her own engine, and then both of them were stationary in her mirror headlights, pointing in two different directions, men piling out into the rain. Nora did not slow down. She took the trail the rest of the way through the pine 2 miles, the truck slewing in the mud branches, whipping the windshield. She came out onto a county road she knew turned east, killed her headlights for the first half mile, then turned them back on and merged onto State Highway 70 at the speed of a woman heading home from her shift. Her hands were shaking. She drove for an hour. She did not go home. She did not go to the shop. She drove east on Interstate 40 past Knoxville and into the foothills of the Smokies, and at 3 in the morning she pulled the F-150 into the gravel lot of a no-name motel outside a town called Sevierville. The kind of motel that took cash and did not photocopy your driver's license. She paid for 3 nights up front. She carried the munitions box into the room on her own back, set it on the floor beside the bed, and slid the dresser in front of the door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands until they stopped shaking. She thought about Wren. Wren was at her mother's house in Knoxville for the night, a thing they did on Tuesdays when Nora worked late. Wren was safe. Wren was asleep under a quilt that Nora's grandmother had stitched in 1962. Wren did not know yet that her mother had inherited a war. Nora picked up the cheap motel phone. She did not call her mother. She did not call the shop. She called the only other number she had memorized that mattered, which was the cell phone of Dr. Halverson at Vanderbilt Children's, and she left a voicemail that said only this: "Doctor, it's Nora Tatum. I am going to need you to move Ren's name to the top of the surgical list. I will have the money in your office in full in cash if you need it by the end of next week. I am asking you a favor. Please." Then she hung up. Then she lay back on the polyester comforter of a motel bed in Sevierville with the lights on, and she did not sleep. She thought. She thought about the way Wallace Holbrook had said by the pound. She thought about the speed with which two unmarked SUVs full of men in tactical jackets had reached a barn on the Cumberland Plateau the morning after a will reading. She thought about her uncle's letter. She thought for a long time about a single sentence on page 47 of a Pictet ledger. And around 5 in the morning, in the cold gray light, before the sun came up over the Smokies, Nora Tatum made the second decision of her new life. She was not going to run. She was going to fight. She did not know how yet. She did not know who could help her. She knew only that whatever her Uncle Percival had been carrying for 40 years, she was carrying now, and the only honest way to put it down was to put it down on the chest of the man who had made him carry it. She slept finally for 2 hours. When she woke up, she opened the ledger again. She had not read past page 47 the night before. She had not had time. Now, in the thin morning light, through cheap polyester curtains, she sat cross-legged on the bed and went back to page 1, and she began to read her uncle's life. The first page was the list of contacts he had promised. 10 names, 10 cities: Geneva, Zurich, London, New York, Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, Beirut, Frankfurt, Vienna. And at the bottom of the list, the one name that did not belong with the others, the one name that was not a banker or a broker or a fence. Ezra Calloway, Knoxville, Tennessee. Investigative desk retired. The Knoxville Sentinel. Trust him with the truth and nothing else. Nora stared at that line for a long time. She did not know an Ezra Calloway. She had never heard her uncle mention him. She did know the Knoxville Sentinel because everybody in East Tennessee over the age of 40 knew the Sentinel, the same way they knew the difference between a black bear and a brown one. She memorized the address her uncle had written beneath the name. Then she went to a payphone outside a gas station in Sevierville because she did not trust her own cell phone anymore, and she called information, and she found that an Ezra Calloway still lived in a small house on the riverside of Knoxville in a neighborhood called Island Home. She drove there. She got there at 1 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in October, with the box of bonds and watches under a tarp in the bed of her truck, and the ledger zipped against her ribs, and a pistol her father had taught her to shoot when she was 14. Sitting on the passenger seat beside her under a folded denim jacket. Ezra Calloway's house was a small white bungalow with peeling paint and a porch that sagged toward the river. There was a Buick from the late 90s in the driveway with one flat tire. There was a screen door with a long tear in the lower panel that had been patched by hand with duct tape. Nora knocked. A long silence. She knocked again. A man's voice from inside, gravelly and unhurried. "Who is it?" "My name is Nora Tatum. I'm Percival Tatum's niece. He told me to find you." Another silence. A longer one. Then the slow, careful footsteps of a man whose knees no longer enjoyed walking. The door opened on a chain. Ezra Calloway looked at her through the gap. I was 75 years old. He had the white hair and the careful posture of a man who had been tall once and had decided not to slouch about getting shorter. His eyes were pale gray and very steady. He was wearing a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he held a coffee mug in his left hand. His right hand, Nora noticed, was inside the pocket of an old cardigan, and the cardigan was hanging in a way that suggested the hand was not empty. He studied her face for a long moment. "You've got his jaw," he said finally. "I've been told. Come around to the kitchen door. Front porch creaks. The whole neighborhood will know you're here." He shut the front door. Nora walked around the side of the house through wet leaves and stood at the kitchen door, and after a moment, Ezra opened it and stepped back without a word. And she walked into a small, clean kitchen that smelled of old coffee and pipe tobacco. There was a yellow legal pad on the table, covered in Ezra Calloway's handwriting. There were 3 newspapers folded in a stack on the counter, 2 of them national, 1 of them the Sentinel. There was a black rotary telephone on the wall. Ezra closed the door behind her. He locked it. He motioned her to a chair. He took his hand out of his cardigan pocket, and Nora saw a small revolver, which he set very calmly on the kitchen counter within reach. "I have to ask you something," he said. "Then I have to ask you something else. The first question is, are you in trouble?" "Yes." "The second question is, do the people who are causing it know my name?" "I don't think so. Not yet." Ezra nodded. He sat down across from her. He waited. Nora unzipped her jacket and laid the ledger on the table between them. Ezra Calloway looked at the cover. He looked at the small gold crest of Pictet et Cie. His pale gray eyes did not widen, but something behind them did. He set his coffee mug down very slowly, as if he were afraid of breaking it. "He kept it," Ezra said, almost to himself. "He kept it. 40 years. 40 years." Ezra reached out and laid one veined hand on the leather cover, just rested it there, the way a man rests his hand on the casket of a friend he has not seen since the war. "I told him to burn it," he said, "in 1985. I told him. He told me the same thing." Ezra looked up at her. "And yet, here we are. And yet, here we are." He let out a long breath. "Open it for me, child. Page 47. She opened it. He read. When he was done, Ezra Calloway took off his reading glasses and set them on the table and rubbed both eyes with the heels of his hands for a long time without speaking. When he lowered his hands, his face had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. I spent 22 years, he said quietly, trying to put that name on a courtroom record. 22 years. I had 3 sources, and one of them died of a heart attack in a hotel in Vienna, and one of them recanted on the witness stand in Frankfurt, and one of them simply vanished off the face of the earth between Helsinki and the next morning. I retired in 1996 because I could not prove it. I could feel it. I could smell it. I could not prove it. He tapped the page with one knuckle. Your uncle could prove it the whole time, and he never gave it to me. He was protecting somebody. He was protecting somebody. Ezra looked at her. Do you know who? No. He sat back in his chair. He looked out the kitchen window for a long time at the gray river running past at the foot of his yard. Sit, he said finally. Drink the coffee. It is bad coffee, but it is hot. I am going to tell you what I think your uncle did in Berlin in the autumn of 1983, and what I think he carried home with him. And I want you to listen all the way to the end before you ask me a single question. Nora sat. She drank the coffee. She listened. Ezra Calloway told her in the slow, ordered, precise way of a man who has rehearsed a story in his head for 40 years without ever once telling it out loud, about a quiet operation in Berlin in October of 1983, about a small splinter of the United States diplomatic mission that had been working with rogue elements of the East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. About the way that splinter had identified families inside East Berlin who were planning to defect with significant private wealth, and about the way that splinter had arranged to intercept those families at the wall, take the wealth, and make sure the families did not survive the crossing in a manner that could be discussed later. He told her about a man named Klaus Renner, a Stasi captain, the operational lead on the East German side. He told her about Wallace Holbrook, a junior liaison officer on the American side, the man who handled the paperwork, the laundering, the bonds, the watches, the small portable wealth that could disappear into Pictet at sea before the bodies were even cold. He told her about one family in particular, a surgeon named Brandt, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, who had been scheduled to come over on the night of October the 11th, 1983, with 12 million Deutschmarks in convertible instruments folded into the lining of the surgeon's overcoat. He told her that the Brandts had not made it. He told her that the daughter had. Your uncle was there that night, Ezra said. He was the engineer attached to the technical surveillance team. He was not supposed to be inside the operation. He was a Lockheed man. He was on loan to NSA for signal work on a different project entirely. He stumbled across what was about to happen because somebody on the American side made a mistake about which van he was supposed to be in. And once he saw it, Nora, he could not unsee it. Ezra leaned forward across the kitchen table. He could not save the parents. He tried. He was too late by 10 minutes. But the the child was in a separate vehicle. The child was going to be quietly disposed of after the parents were taken care of, because the operation could not afford a witness, even a witness who could not yet speak in full sentences. He let that sit. Nora set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table. He took the child. He took the child. How?
I do not know exactly how. I have always suspected he killed two men to do it. He never said.
He came back across the wall on the morning of October 12th with a 2-year-old girl wrapped in his overcoat and the contents of that munitions box in a duffel bag. And he handed both of them to a man at the embassy. He trusted, and he said, "I need this child to disappear, and I need this money to disappear with her, and I need a name on a passport that will hold up, and I need it inside 48 hours." And the man at the embassy did exactly that. The man at the embassy was me, Nora. She looked at him. He looked back at her without apology. "I was 34 years old," Ezra said. "I was a junior cultural attaché, which is a job title I no longer have to explain to anybody. I am the one who placed that child with a family. I am the one who chose the name. I am the one who chose the state. I am the one who has watched her from a distance for 43 years and made sure nothing happened to her."
Where is she?
Ezra Calloway looked at his coffee. "She is closer than you think." He would not say more. He told her instead about what had happened next. I told her that Wallace Holbrook had spent 40 years believing that Percival Tatum had taken a payoff and walked away. Bonds watches silence. Holbrook had not known that Percival had kept the ledger. He had not known that Percival had kept the child. He had built a law firm on the laundered money and the assumption that the secret was sealed. And the assumption had been almost correct, because Percival Tatum had never spoken the secret out loud to anyone except once, in 1985, to a young journalist named Ezra Calloway, who had agreed to keep it. "And Renner," Nora said. "Renner went back to East Berlin and survived the fall of the wall by being useful to the right new people. Renner has spent his entire life looking for that ledger. Renner is the reason your uncle moved to Hollow Creek and stayed there. Renner is the reason the Plymouth never got driven. Your uncle was not a paranoid old engineer, Nora. Your uncle was a man with a Stasi captain looking for him for 40 years. Is he still alive?" Ezra Calloway looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "He is in this country," he said. "He arrived 3 weeks ago on a Swiss passport that says he is named Otto Reinhardt into Atlanta. I have a friend at the Federal Building who still owes me. Renner has been moving north for 2 weeks, Nora. He was in Chattanooga last Friday. He was in Knoxville on Monday morning." Monday morning. The morning of the will reading. Nora sat very still. She thought about Wren. She thought about her mother's house in Knoxville, where Wren was right now eating a peanut butter sandwich with the crusts cut off. She thought about Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville, where Wren had a follow-up appointment in 11 days. She thought about how easy it would be for a man with 40 years of practice to walk into a children's ward in a baseball cap and ask very politely where he might find his great niece. She stood up so fast the kitchen chair scraped back across the linoleum. Ezra raised both hands. "Sit down, Nora. He has not made a move on the child. He does not know about the child. He is looking for the book. He is looking for me. He is looking for what is in your jacket. You are incidental until you stop being incidental. Sit down." She did not sit down. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the river and gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white. "My daughter is 7 years old," she said. "She has a hole in her heart you could put a quarter through. She is in Knoxville right now. If anything happens to her because of a book my uncle wrote in 1983, Ezra, burn this whole town down to the riverbed." "I believe you would." She turned around. "What do I do?" Ezra Calloway folded his veined old hands on the kitchen table. "You do 3 things," he said. "You move the child tonight, not to your mother's, not to your shop. There is a woman I trust in a town outside Nashville, a pediatric nurse who used to work for Vanderbilt and who owes me a debt that has nothing to do with any of this. She will take Wren for a week. I will give you the address. You will drive Wren there yourself, and you will not stop on the road, and you will not tell your mother where you are going. 2. You and I will copy this ledger, every page, twice. 1 copy goes to a safety deposit box in a bank in Atlanta under a name I will give you, and the 2nd copy goes to a lawyer I trust named Imogen Whitfield, who is the only lawyer in the state of Tennessee that Wallace Holbrook is genuinely afraid of, because she is the lawyer who got him disbarred briefly in 1991, and he has never forgiven her or beaten her. Imogen will hold the 2nd copy in escrow with instructions to release it to the Department of Justice, the IRS, and 3 named newspapers if she does not hear from you personally by voice every 24 hours. A dead man's switch. A dead man's switch. 3. Ezra Calloway looked at her. 3 is the hard one, Nora. Tell me. 3 is that I am going to tell you who the child is, because she has the right to know, and because she has a right to be in the room when this ends, and because the only way to put Wallace Holbrook in a federal prison and Klaus Renner in the ground is to put a living human being on a witness stand whose parents were murdered for the money in your truck. Nora waited. Ezra reached across the table and laid 1 hand very gently on the back of hers. Her name is Helena Brandt Mercer, he said. She is 45 years old. She teaches piano to children in a music studio above a coffee shop on the River Walk in Chattanooga. She does not know any of this. She believes her parents died in a car accident in Atlanta when she was 3. She has lived a quiet, kind, small life, and she has not deserved any of what you are about to bring to her door. He squeezed her hand once. But she has earned it, Nora. She has earned the right to know who her father was and what he was trying to do and why he died. And so have you, and so has your daughter. Now drink the rest of that coffee. We have work to do, and the daylight is not waiting on us. Nora drove Wren that night. She picked the child up from her mother's house at 7 in the evening with a small overnight bag and a story about a friend in Nashville who needed help with her own little girl. She buckled Wren into the back of the F-150. She drove west on Interstate 40 with one eye in the rearview mirror the whole way. She did not stop for gas in any town she had ever stopped for gas in before. She arrived at a small farmhouse outside Dixon at 1 in the morning, and a woman named Loretta Pace, 60 years old, retired pediatric nurse, opened the door before Nora had finished climbing the porch steps, and Loretta took one look at Wren asleep in Nora's arms and said only, "Ezra called. Come in. The kettle is on." Nora kissed her daughter on the forehead. She tucked her into a small, clean bed in a room with a quilt on the wall. She stood in the doorway for 2 minutes and looked at her child, and she did not let herself cry until she was back in the truck. And even then, she only let herself cry for the length of one country song on the radio before she turned the radio off and pointed the truck back east. She slept 4 hours at a truck stop outside Cookeville. She met Ezra at his kitchen table at 9 the next morning. They copied the ledger. It took them 11 hours on a small flatbed scanner Ezra had owned since 2003, and a cheap inkjet printer that ran out of black ink twice. They worked in silence except for the small sounds of paper moving and the larger sounds of an old man pouring an occasional fresh cup of coffee. By 8 that night, they had 2 complete copies of every page, 273 pages each, bound in cheap black plastic combs. One copy went into a padded envelope that Ezra hand-addressed to a deposit box at SunTrust in Atlanta under the name Tatum Holdings, LLC, a shell Imogen Whitfield had quietly created that afternoon over the phone. The second copy went into the trunk of the Buick with the flat tire, which Ezra revealed had a perfectly functional spare he had been pretending not to own for 2 years. He drove the original ledger to Imogen Whitfield's office in downtown Knoxville himself. He came back at midnight. He sat down at the kitchen table. He said, "It is done. She has it. The switch is set. You have 24 hours from this minute to call her by voice, or the lawyers in Washington start opening envelopes." Nora exhaled. For 1 second, for the first time since Monday morning, she felt the smallest, thinnest possible thread of something like hope. The kitchen phone rang. It was the wall phone, the black rotary. Ezra Calloway looked at it like a man looks at a snake. He answered it on the 3rd ring. He listened. He hung up. He stood very still by the wall for a long moment, his hand still on the receiver. Then he turned around, and Nora saw that his face had gone the color of old paper. "That was Marlene at the Sentinel switchboard," he said. "She still works the late desk on Wednesdays. Old friend of mine. She called to tell me that the fire department has been at my house for the last 40 minutes. Nora was on her feet. "What?" My house, Nora. The bungalow on Island Home. It is on fire. The whole thing. They are saying gas leak. They are saying the line ruptured in the crawl space. They are saying it is a miracle nobody was home. She stared at him. Ezra. I know. Ezra, the copies. The copies are safe. The original is with Imogen. We did not lose anything, Nora. We did not lose anything except a house and a kitchen table and 40 years of newspaper clippings. We did not lose the thing that matters. He turned to her. But it means they are moving. It means they have decided I am part of this. It means that within an hour, somebody is going to notice that I am not in the house, and the next place they are going to look for me is anywhere you might be. Then we go. Then we go. They went. They drove south through the night in 2 vehicles, Nora in her F-150, with the munitions box still under the tarp, and Ezra in his old Buick with the second copy of the ledger in the trunk. And they did not speak on the road, and they did not use cell phones, and they did not stop until the gray dawn was breaking over the river in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Ezra parked outside a small brick building on the Riverwalk. There was a coffee shop on the ground floor that did not open until 7. There was a music studio on the second floor whose lights were already on because some music teachers begin their day before the city wakes up. He turned in the driver's seat. He looked at Nora through the window of her truck. He nodded once the way old men nod when they mean it. You are going to go upstairs, he said. You are going to introduce yourself. You are going to tell her gently who her father was. You are going to show her a single page from the ledger, and you are going to ask her, and only ask her, if she will sit down with you and a lawyer in Knoxville tomorrow morning. And if she says no, she will not say no. How do you know? Ezra Calloway smiled for the first time in 3 days. It was a small, tired, beautiful smile. Because she is her father's daughter, he said, and because I have known her from a distance since the night she came across the wall in your uncle's overcoat. And because in 43 years, Nora, I have never once seen her walk away from somebody who told her the truth. Nora climbed the wooden stairs on the side of the brick building. She knocked on the door at the top. A woman opened it. 45 years old, tall, dark blonde hair pinned back from her face, glasses on a chain around her neck. The faintest accent under her English, an accent she would never have been able to name herself. The woman looked at Nora. The woman looked at the leather-bound ledger in Nora's hands. The woman went very, very still. You have his eyes, Helena Brant Mercer said quietly. You have Percival Tatum's eyes. Helena Brant Mercer stepped back from the doorway without another word. She did not ask Nora to explain. She did not ask why a stranger was standing on her landing at 6 in the morning with a leather-bound book and red-rimmed eyes. She simply turned and walked back into the small, bright music studio above the coffee shop on the River Walk and Nora understood that she was meant to follow. The studio smelled of beeswax polish and old sheet music. A grand piano stood against one wall, its lid propped open. A second, smaller upright sat in the corner under a window that looked out over the Tennessee River, where the early sun was just beginning to lay a thin gold seam along the water. There was a low couch covered in faded green velvet, a tea kettle on a hot plate, a bookshelf that ran the length of one wall, packed with scores from floor to ceiling. Helena went to the kettle and turned it on. Her hands, Nora noticed, were perfectly steady. The hands of a woman who had played a Brahms intermezzo through her own mother's funeral and a child's first recital, both, and had learned the difference between trembling and feeling. My adoptive mother died in 2009, Helena said quietly, her back to Nora. Pancreatic cancer. She was a good woman. She was a librarian in a small town in North Georgia, and she raised me alone, and she never married, and she told me when I was 11 years old that I had been adopted as a toddler from a family in Atlanta who had died in a car accident. She turned around. I have known since I was 19 that the story was not true. I have not known what the true story was. I have waited a very long time, Mrs. Tatum, for someone to come and tell me. Nora opened her mouth to speak and found that she could not. Helena gestured to the velvet couch. She set out 2 mugs. She poured the tea. She sat down across from Nora in a small wooden chair, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she said very simply, "Begin." Nora began. She told it the way Ezra had told her, in order, without ornament. The autumn of 1983. A surgeon named Brandt and his wife and a 2-year-old daughter and 12 million Deutschmarks sewn into the lining of a coat. A splinter group of Americans and East Germans who had decided that the wealth could be intercepted and the witnesses could be removed. A Lockheed engineer named Percival Tatum on loan for signal work who had stumbled into the wrong van on the wrong night. A child wrapped in an overcoat. A walk across the wall in the gray hour before dawn on October the 12th. A young cultural attaché in West Berlin named Ezra Calloway, who had agreed to make a passport and a name and a state and a family appear inside 48 hours. Helena listened. She did not interrupt. She did not weep. She did not look away. When Nora was finished, Helena Brandt. Mercer sat for a long, quiet minute with her hands still folded in her lap and her eyes on the window where the river was now fully gold. And then she said in a voice that did not shake, "May I see his handwriting?" Nora opened the ledger. She turned to page 1 where Percival Tatum had written 10 names in 10 cities in his careful, narrow hand. She turned the book so that it faced Helena. Helena reached out one finger. She did not touch the page. She held her finger an inch above her father's handwriting for a long moment, and then she lowered it and laid the pad of her index finger against the ink, and she closed her eyes. "I have a memory," she said. "Just one. I have always assumed it was a dream. There is a man with a beard. He is carrying me. It is very cold. I am wrapped in something heavy, and the heavy thing smells of pipe tobacco. He is whispering to me. He keeps telling me to be quiet, to be a good girl, just for a little longer, and then he is going to take me somewhere warm. She opened her eyes. That was him. That was him. Helena Brandt Mercer put both hands over her face. She wept then without sound for 90 seconds, the way a grown woman weeps when she has been holding a particular grief for 43 years without knowing its name. Nora did not move. She did not say anything. She let the woman across from her have those 90 seconds alone in the company of someone who finally knew what they were for. When Helena lowered her hands, her eyes were dry again, and her face had set into something Nora recognized, because it was the same expression she had seen in her own bathroom mirror at 5 in the morning in a motel in Sevierville. "What do you need from me?" Helena said. "I need you to come to Knoxville tomorrow morning." "Tell me when. Tell me where." 8 a.m., the offices of Whitfield Legal. Imogen Whitfield. She is the lawyer. She will explain what we are doing. I will be there at 7:30. Helena stood up. She walked to the bookshelf. From the back of the lowest shelf, she pulled out a small wooden box, the kind a child might keep treasures in. She opened it. She lifted out a single photograph, black and white, very small, very old. She brought it back to the couch and handed it to Nora. The photograph showed a man in a dark overcoat, mid-30s, dark hair, narrow face, holding a small bundle wrapped against the cold. The man was not looking at the camera. He was looking down at the bundle. Even in black and white, even at 43 years removed, Nora knew the jaw. "It was inside the lining of the coat I was wearing when I arrived in Georgia," Helena said. "My adoptive mother kept it for me. She said when I was old enough I could decide what to do with it. I have never been old enough until this morning." Nora handed the photograph back. "Bring it tomorrow." "I will." They drove north out of Chattanooga at 7 that morning in 2 vehicles. Helena in her own small sedan behind the F-150. Ezra ahead of them in the Buick, 3 cars, climbing the long grade out of the river valley toward Knoxville with the autumn light hard on their windshields. Nora did not turn on the radio. She drove the speed limit. She watched the mirrors. She had called Loretta Pace from a payphone at a gas station outside Athens. Wren had slept 11 hours. Wren had eaten pancakes for breakfast. Wren was building a fort in the living room out of couch cushions and was asking politely when her mother was coming back. "Soon, sweetheart," Nora had said into the phone. "Soon. Be good for Miss Loretta. I love you to the moon and back. I love you to the moon and back and around again." That had been their thing since Wren was 4. Nora had hung up the phone in the gas station parking lot and stood for 30 seconds with her forehead pressed against the cold metal of the booth. And then she had gotten back in her truck and driven on. In Knoxville, Imogen Whitfield was waiting. Imogen Whitfield was 62 years old, 5 feet 2 inches in low heels, white-haired, blue-eyed, and built along the lines of a woman who had been a competitive equestrian until her knees had stopped agreeing. Her office occupied the third floor of a renovated tobacco warehouse on Gay Street, with exposed brick walls and original heart pine floors and a wall of windows that looked east toward the river. She wore a gray pantsuit and a single strand of small pearls, and the expression of a woman who had once gotten the senior partner of Holbrook and Vance disbarred for 9 months and had been waiting patiently for 35 years to do it again on a larger scale. She shook Nora's hand. She shook Helena's hand. She nodded once at Ezra, who nodded once back, and Nora understood from the nod that they had known each other for a very long time and had never discussed it out loud with anyone present. Imogen sat them down at a long oak conference table. She set a yellow legal pad in front of herself. She said, "Ladies, Mr. Calloway, we are not going to do this with the federal government." Nora looked at her. Why? Because Wallace Holbrook has friends inside the Knoxville field office. I have known about 2 of them for 11 years. I do not know how many others he has, and I am not willing to bet your daughter's life on the size of the number. We are going to do this ourselves. We are going to do it cleanly. We are going to do it in such a way that when the federal government arrives at the end, the only thing they have left to do is sign the paperwork. She looked at the 3 of them in turn. Are we agreed? Nora said yes. Helena said yes. Ezra Calloway slowly said yes. Imogen Whitfield laid out the plan. It was a simple plan, the way the best plans are simple. Nora would call Wallace Holbrook personally. She would tell him in a frightened, exhausted voice that she had reconsidered his offer, that she was in over her head, that she wanted the $50,000, and she wanted him to take the ledger and the box and the whole nightmare off her hands, and she wanted to do the exchange tonight at the barn at Hollow Creek, because the barn was private and quiet, and she did not want any witnesses. Holbrook would come. He would not come alone. He would come with Klaus Renner, because Renner had spent 40 years looking for the book, and Renner was not going to let Holbrook touch the book without him in the same room. And he would come with whatever was left of his private security after the muddy disaster on the logging trail 2 nights ago, which Ezra's friend at the federal building estimated was 4 men, possibly 5. When they arrived, Nora would be alone inside the barn. The ledger would be on the hood of the Plymouth. The munitions box would be on the dirt floor beside the car. Nora would be standing in the open. She would be unarmed visibly. She would not be alone. Imogen Whitfield was going to be in the loft of the barn, which Nora had not climbed up to in 14 years and had forgotten existed until Imogen had drawn the floor plan from memory off a deposition she had read in 1988. Imogen would have a high-definition video camera, a long-directional microphone, and a satellite uplink that would stream every word and every image live to 3 places at once. A locked server in Atlanta, a locked server at the Sentinel, and the personal cell phone of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Tennessee. A woman named Carla Ruiz, who had been Imogen Whitfield's law school roommate in 1986 and who had 3 months ago opened her own quiet investigation into Wallace Holbrook for reasons that had nothing to do with Berlin. Helena Brant Mercer would be in the woods at the tree line with Ezra Calloway's sworn affidavit already in hand, ready to identify herself by name and by photograph as the surviving daughter of the Brant family. The moment Holbrook spoke aloud the words that confirmed he had ordered her parents killed. And the barn itself. The barn itself Nora was going to prepare. "Tell me what you need," Imogen said. "Tell me what your uncle built into that building." Nora thought about it. She thought about a summer when she was 16 years old. "He had a system of pulleys," she said. "He used to use it to lift engine blocks down from the loft. Big steel cable, 3/4 inch, counterweighted. He ran it through the rafters. The trigger was a single iron pin under the floorboard near the back doors. Step on the pin, the counterweight drops, the cable snaps the load free, and whatever is hanging from the loft comes down." "How heavy?" "I helped him bring a small block Chevy down with it once. 400 pounds, give or take." "What is hanging in the loft now?" "Last time I was up there in 2010, there were 3 steel I-beam offcuts, about 80 pounds each. He had them rigged on a single cable bundle. I do not know if the rigging is still good." Imogen made a note. "You are going to find out tomorrow afternoon. You are going to test it. You are going to make sure that pin still triggers and that those beams still drop. If the rigging is rotten, you are going to fix it. Can you fix it?" "I can fix it." "Then fix it." The meeting ended at noon. Nora drove to Hollow Creek alone in the F-150. She arrived at the barn at 1:30 in the afternoon. The mud from 2 nights ago had begun to dry. The chain still lay where she had left it. The sliding door was still pulled back the 6 feet she had pulled it back on Tuesday night. The Plymouth still sat in the center of the dirt floor as if waiting for her. She climbed the wooden ladder into the loft. The loft was lower ceilinged than she remembered, the way every space from childhood is lower ceilinged than you remembered. Dust hung in the slanted bars of afternoon light coming through the holes in the tin roof. The smell up here was old hay and dry wood, and the particular cedar and iron smell of a place built by a man who had loved both. The cable was still there. She traced it with her hand from where it ran out of the rafters and down through a hole in the loft floor to the pulley system. Her uncle had bolted into the eastern wall. She climbed back down. She found the iron pin under the floorboard near the rear doors, exactly where she had remembered. She stepped on it experimentally with her heel. The counterweight in the wall slid an inch. The cable in the loft creaked. Nothing else moved because nothing was loaded into the drop position. The mechanism worked. She climbed back into the loft. She inspected the 3 I-beam offcuts. The rigging cable was rusted but intact. She tested each loop. She added 2 new shackles she had brought from her shop. She greased the pulley. She replaced the trigger spring with a new one out of her toolbox. A stiffer spring, the kind that would not give under the weight of a man stepping lightly, but would release the full second. A man stepped with the confidence of having arrived at the place he intended to take. She rigged the beams over the spot inside the barn where Wallace Holbrook would have to stand if he wanted to read the open ledger on the hood of the Plymouth. She tested it once. The beams dropped. 3 of them, 80 pounds apiece. They hit the dirt floor with a sound like the closing of a vault, and the impact crater in the dirt was nearly a foot deep. She reset the rigging. She climbed down out of the loft. She walked out of the barn into the cold afternoon air and stood for a moment with her face turned up to the sky. And she thought about her uncle, and she said very quietly to nobody, "All right, Perce, let's finish what you started." She called Wallace Holbrook from a payphone at 5 o'clock. She used the frightened voice. She used the exhausted voice. She used the voice of a woman in over her head, which was not difficult because part of her was in fact in over her head, and the part that was not in over her head was very good at acting. Holbrook agreed. He agreed too quickly. He did not negotiate the price. He did not push back on the location. He said, 8 o'clock, the barn. You bring the book and the box, and you walk away with $50,000 in cash. Mrs. Tatum and you and your daughter never have to think about any of this again. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock. He hung up. Nora stood in the phone booth for a long second and listened to the dial tone, and she thought, "You are going to come at 7:30, you old snake, because you are going to want to walk the building first." She drove back to the barn. She was inside the loft by 6. Imogen Whitfield arrived at 6:15 with her camera, her microphone, her satellite uplink, and a thermos of black coffee. She climbed the wooden ladder with the easy grace of a woman who had grown up on a horse farm and refused to apologize for being 62. She set up her gear behind the stacked hay bales at the south end of the loft. She tested her uplink twice. She poured Nora a cup of coffee. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She
sat down on a wooden crate and said nothing.
Ezra Calloway and Helena Brandt Mercer were already in the tree line 200 yards out in a small camouflaged blind that Ezra had quietly used 20 years ago for an unrelated story he had never published. At 7:26, 2 pairs of headlights swung off Cumberland Loop Road and turned up the tractor path. Imogen Whitfield clicked her camera on. The lead vehicle this time was a dark blue Cadillac Escalade, the kind of vehicle a senior partner uses when he wants to look professional but does not want to look like federal law enforcement. Behind it came a single black Suburban, the same model as the 2 from Tuesday, possibly one of the same 2 washed. Wallace Holbrook got out of the Escalade. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a long camel hair overcoat. He carried no briefcase. He had a small silver flashlight in his right hand, which he clicked on and panned slowly across the front of the barn. From the passenger side of the Escalade, a second man stepped out. He was 74 years old. He was lean. He was bald, with the kind of clean baldness that comes from a man who shaves his own head every morning. He wore black trousers and a heavy black wool coat and gloves and a small earpiece that Nora could see from the loft, only because she knew to look for it. Klaus Renner. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 40 years looking for a book. 4 men got out of the Suburban. They wore the same matte black tactical jackets Nora had seen on Tuesday. They moved the way they had moved on Tuesday. One of them carried what was unmistakably a short carbine slung along his back under his coat. Holbrook gestured. Two of the four spread out toward the corners of the barn. One stayed at the Suburban. The fourth came to the door with the bolt cutters Nora had seen on Tuesday and started to cut the chain that she had carefully re-looped that afternoon. The chain that this time had no padlock on it and had not needed to be cut. But a man with bolt cutters in his hand likes to use them. The chain dropped. The sliding door rolled back. Nora Tatum stepped out from behind the Plymouth into the open beam of Holbrook's flashlight. Mr. Holbrook. Mrs. Tatum. He clicked the flashlight off. He walked into the barn at the unhurried pace of a man who believed himself to be the most powerful person in the room. Klaus Renner walked one step behind him and to his right. Two of the four men in tactical jackets followed at a distance of about 15 feet, the carbine slung but not unslung. The book, Holbrook said, on the hood. He looked. He saw the ledger lying open on the rust-pitted hood of the 1958 Plymouth Belvedere. He took a step toward it, then he stopped. He turned his head slightly. And the box. On the floor by the front wheel. He saw the olive-drab munitions box. He smiled faintly. You have been very sensible, Mrs. Tatum. I want you to know I appreciate it. I want my $50,000. In the Escalade, after I verify the book. Verify it then. I want to go home to my daughter. Holbrook smiled the way a cat smiles. He took 2 more steps forward, and Klaus Renner moved with him, and the 2 tactical men moved with both of them, and the 4 of them came to a stop, exactly where Nora had calculated they would have to stop in order to read an open ledger on the hood of a car at a comfortable adult male reading distance. Holbrook leaned forward. His eyes dropped to the open page. He read. His face changed. It changed slowly at first, the way a face changes when a man realizes he has been looking at the wrong page in the wrong room with the wrong company present. Then it changed faster. Then his face was no longer a face. It was a mask of a face that a man has worn for 40 years, pretending to be a senior partner of a respectable law firm in East Tennessee. This is not the original, he said. It is one of 3 copies. Where are the others? Atlanta, Knoxville, and one in the hands of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District who is at this moment listening to this conversation. Holbrook went very still. Klaus Renner did not. Renner's hand went inside his coat. In the loft, Imogen Whitfield did not move the camera and did not stop recording. Her free hand very calmly found the small black object on the crate beside her, the one Nora had not asked her about, and Imogen Whitfield did what Imogen Whitfield had quietly trained in the basement range of her Knoxville home to do 3 nights a week for the last 6 years, in case the day ever came when Wallace Holbrook walked into a room she was in. She did not have to use it, because Nora Tatum took one small step backward, planted her right boot squarely on the iron pin beneath the floorboard, and the counterweight on the eastern wall of the barn slid down its track with a dry whisper of 40-year-old steel cable, and the 3 80-pound I-beam offcuts came down out of the rafters of the loft in a clean, braced bundle and landed with the unhurried inevitability of physics exactly on top of the 2 tactical men in the black jackets standing 15 feet behind Holbrook and Renner. Both men went down hard. One of them did not get back up. The carbine clattered across the dirt floor and slid under the Plymouth. Renner had the pistol out. He was fast. He was not fast enough for a woman who had thought about this exact second for 2 days. Nora dropped flat behind the front fender of the Plymouth as the first round went past her shoulder and punched through the cedar wall of the barn behind her. The second round took out the halogen work light. The third round hit the hood of the Plymouth and ricocheted up into the rafters. From the loft, very calmly, Imogen Whitfield said into a small black radio, "Now." From the tree line, at the edge of the clearing, 3 flashlights came on at once, very bright, very high lumen. The kind of lights that arrive with men who are about to identify themselves as Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, because Imogen Whitfield had not in fact agreed to do this without the state government. She had only agreed to do it without the federal government. 6 TBI agents in body armor came out of the woods at a dead run. The man at the Suburban dropped his weapon and went down on his knees with his hands behind his head before anyone had finished saying the word "freeze." The 4th tactical man, the one who had been working the eastern corner of the barn, turned to run and made it 20 feet before 2 agents had him face down in the wet grass. Holbrook did not move. Holbrook was a senior partner. He understood with the absolute clarity of a man who had spent 45 years inside the legal system that he was now an arrested man, and that any movement he made in the next 60 seconds would be photographed and recorded and used against him forever. He raised his hands very slowly to his shoulders. He did not look at the ledger. He did not look at Nora. He looked for one long second at the open barn door and the cold October stars beyond it. Klaus Renner did not raise his hands. Klaus Renner had spent 40 years not raising his hands. Klaus Renner turned, fired 1 round at the loft that punched harmlessly through a hay bale 18 inches to the left of Imogen Whitfield, and then he ran for the back of the barn for the small side door her uncle had cut into the eastern wall in 1979 to let in summer air. Nora came up off the dirt floor. She went after him. She did not know later why she did it. She would tell Imogen weeks afterward that she had not made a decision so much as that her body had simply gone. Renner had a pistol. She did not. Renner was a trained operations officer. She was not. None of it had mattered in the moment. He had killed Helena's parents. He had stood in a room and ordered the death of a 2-year-old child. He had walked into the children's ward at Vanderbilt on a Monday afternoon 4 days ago in a baseball cap and asked very politely about her 7-year-old daughter. I was not going to walk out of these woods. She came through the side door, 6 seconds behind him. The clearing behind the barn ran 20 yards to the edge of the woods and beyond the woods. Half a mile of black pine ran down to the lip of the Cumberland Gorge, a 400-foot drop to the river at the bottom that the kids in Hollow Creek had been daring each other to look over the edge of since before the Civil War. Renner ran north toward the gorge. He did not know the woods. Nora did. She did not chase him. She cut him. She knew the way she knew the layout of her own shop, that he would have to slow at a deadfall about 100 yards into the pine, because the deadfall was a tangle of 3 blown-down trees from an ice storm in 2003. And there was only one way through it for a man wearing a long, heavy coat and dress shoes. She knew because her uncle had hunted deer along this stretch for 20 years and had taught her exactly which trails the deer used and exactly which trails the deer avoided. She angled left. She went around the deadfall on the deer trail. She came out on the far side 10 seconds ahead of him, and she put her back flat against the trunk of a white oak with a circumference of 8 feet. And she waited. Renner came through the deadfall breathing hard. I was 74 years old. He had run 100 yards uphill in heavy clothing on a cold night. His coat had caught on a branch and torn at the shoulder. His pistol was still in his hand. His earpiece was gone. There was blood at his temple, where a piece of broken branch had caught him. He did not see her. He went past the oak. Nora let him take 3 more strides. Then she stepped out behind him and said in a voice that was perfectly calm, "Mr. Renner." He spun. The pistol came up. I was fast. He was old. The old part won. Klaus Renner's right foot in its smooth-soled dress shoe came down on a patch of wet moss at the edge of the next deer trail, and the moss slid the way. Moss slides on wet limestone, and his ankle turned, and the muzzle of his pistol came up 2 inches higher than he had intended, and his free hand reached for a balance that was not there. The lip of the Cumberland Gorge was 11 feet behind him. Klaus Renner went over the edge backward. He did not scream. Nora stood at the oak and listened to the long silence that followed, and then to the very small, very far sound of a body hitting limestone 400 feet down, and then to the silence after that. She did not look over the edge. She turned around and walked back through the deadfall, and back through the pine, and back across the clearing to the barn, where the TBI agents had Holbrook in cuffs against the side of the Suburban, and where Imogen Whitfield was climbing slowly down the loft ladder, with her camera still recording, and where Helena Brandt Mercer was running across the wet grass toward the open barn door with Ezra Calloway shouting after her to slow down. Helena reached Nora first. She did not hug her. She took both of Nora's hands in both of her own. She looked at Nora's face for a long second. "Where is he?" "He went over the gorge." Helena Brandt Mercer closed her eyes. She stood there for a moment with her hands holding Nora's hands, and she breathed in and she breathed out. And Nora understood that whatever piece of her had been waiting 43 years for that exact piece of news, had just received it. "Thank you," Helena said. "You are welcome." The trial was a small one in the end. Wallace Holbrook took a plea on the third day. His own lawyer, a man he had hired out of Atlanta for $900 an hour, told him in the hallway of the federal courthouse in Knoxville that no jury in Tennessee was going to acquit a senior partner who had been recorded on video with 8 separate corroborating witnesses ordering the laundering of a kidnapped child's stolen inheritance through a Swiss bank for 40 years. Holbrook signed the paper. I got 35 years without parole. He would be 103 when he came out, if he came out. His personal assets were frozen, then forfeited. The contents of the munitions box were inventoried, then cataloged, then evaluated by a quiet team out of the U.S. Treasury, working with a small panel of independent historians and the West German government, none of whom had been aware that the Brandt family's wealth had been preserved in any form. After 90 days of careful work, 3 findings were issued. The first was that 60% of the contents by valuation were ruled the rightful inheritance of one Helena Brandt Mercer, sole surviving heir of the Brandt family of East Berlin, as established by the photograph in her possession, by Ezra Calloway's affidavit, by Percival Tatum's letter, and by a DNA test performed against a sealed sample taken from the Brandt family physician's records in 1980. The second was that 30% of the contents by valuation were assigned at the request of all parties involved and signed off by the U.S. Attorney to the establishment of the Silas Tatum Pediatric Cardiology Endowment at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville, named after Nora's late husband, with a board of directors that included Nora Helena Imogen and Dr. Halverson, and with the explicit mandate to fund the surgical care of children from rural East Tennessee who could not afford the care they needed. The third was that 10% of the contents by valuation were released to Nora Tatum free and clear for the care of her family and the maintenance of the Hollow Creek property. 10% of that box was $900,000. It was enough. It was more than enough. Wren had her surgery on the 14th of December. It went well. Dr. Halverson came out into the waiting room at 11 minutes after midnight on the 15th and put one hand on Nora's shoulder and said, "She is going to be fine, Nora. She is going to be just fine." Nora did not cry. She had used up all of that again. She nodded once, and she sat down on the plastic chair in the waiting room of Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, and she held Helena Brandt Mercer's hand on one side and Ezra Calloway's hand on the other, and she breathed. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in early May, the sign over the front of the building came down. Tatum and Son, Auto and Welding, had been alive for 20 years, and Nora had stopped wanting to live inside it. The new sign went up that afternoon. She had had it painted in Knoxville by a man who specialized in restoring old shop signs. It was hand-lettered dark green on cream with a small, careful border in gold leaf. Tatum and Daughter, Auto Welding and Mentorship, Hollow Creek, Tennessee, St. 1991, reopened 2026. Underneath, in smaller letters, the words she had asked the painter to add at the last minute. Girls welcome. The shop was full that day. There was a brisk wind off the Cumberland Plateau. There were 3 trucks and a tractor in the lot. There was a folding table set up with coffee and pound cake. There were 6 teenage girls from Cumberland County, ranging from 12 to 17, standing in a small, uneasy cluster near the open bay door, waiting to find out whether the rumor was true that the new shop was going to take apprentices for the summer. Nora Tatum stood on the porch in her work jacket and watched them. Wren stood beside her, pink-cheeked, healthy 7.5-years-old hand tucked inside her mother's. Wren had been told by Helena that she was now in possession of a very large aunt who lived in Chattanooga and played the piano, and Wren had taken to calling Helena Aunt Lena. And Helena had taken to calling Wren her favorite niece in the world, which was a true statement because Wren was the only niece Helena had. Helena was inside the shop looking at the Plymouth. The Plymouth was finished. Nora had spent 4 months on it, evenings and weekends. She had pulled the frame and rebuilt it. She had replaced the floor pans with great care around the area where the steel plate had once been. She had repaired the body. She had stripped the rust. She had sourced a correct front bench seat. She had rebuilt the engine from the block up with new pistons, new bearings, new gaskets, a rebuilt carburetor, and a new electrical harness. She had painted it the original color. She had found a paint chip in a sample book in her uncle's tool drawer, a small square of blue the color of the sky over the Smokies on a clear October afternoon. The factory name had been printed beneath it in tiny letters. Belvedere Sky Blue. The Plymouth sat in the front bay of the shop, now gleaming. It looked the way it must have looked on the showroom floor in 1958. The chrome was clean. The tail fins were straight. The windshield was new. Helena stood in front of it for a long time. She did not touch it. She just looked. Then she walked back out onto the porch and stood beside Nora. He would have loved seeing this, Helena said. He saw it. He saw it the day he hid the box. He saw it every day after. You think so? I know so. They stood quietly for a moment. The wind came up off the plateau and moved the new sign on its chains. The 6 girls in the parking lot were beginning to laugh nervously about something. Ezra Calloway, 75 years old, was sitting in a folding chair near the coffee table, eating a slice of pound cake, and Imogen Whitfield, in jeans and a barn jacket Nora had not believed she owned, was leaning against the fender of her own car, talking to one of the older teenagers about the difference between a clutch master cylinder and a slave cylinder. Wren tugged at Nora's hand. Mama. Yes, baby. Can I show the big girls how the welding hood works? Nora looked down at her daughter. She thought about a summer afternoon in 1997 when a 9-year-old girl had stood on an overturned milk crate in the back of the same shop, with a man's enormous leather gloves wrapped around her small hands and a welding hood lowered carefully over her face. A voice in her ear that had said, "Men build airplanes. Nora, women like you build whole worlds of their own." Yes, sweetheart, Nora said. Yes, you can show the big girls how the welding hood works. Walk slow. Hold the railing on the steps. Wren let go of her mother's hand and ran for the bay door. Nora watched her go. Later that evening, after the apprentices had been signed up and the pound cake had been eaten, and Helena had driven back toward Chattanooga, and Ezra had gone home to the small new house Imogen had helped him buy on the river, Nora walked alone up the long rise from the barn to the white Victorian on the ridge where her uncle had lived for the last 40 years of his life. She did not go to the house. She went past it to the small family cemetery at the edge of the ridge where 6 generations of Tatums lay beneath an old white oak tree. She stood at her uncle's stone for a long time. The stone was simple. It said, Percival Daniel Tatum, 1945 to 2026, engineer, uncle, keeper. She had asked for that last word herself. The light was beginning to go behind the ridge. The shadows of the oak were long across the grass. Somewhere down the slope, a whippoorwill called twice and went quiet. Nora reached into her jacket pocket. She took out the brass key. It was clean now. She had taken a wire brush to it one evening that winter in the quiet of the shop, and the green oxidation had come away to reveal the dark, dense brass beneath. It was warm in her hand. It had been warm in her hand for 6 months. She knelt at the base of the headstone and pressed the key gently into the soft earth at the foot of her uncle's grave. She left it there. You hid the best thing inside the worst-looking thing, Perce, she said quietly. I understand, and I am going to teach them. I am going to teach all of them, every girl who comes through that door. She stood up. She walked back down the ridge toward the barn where the new sign was swinging in the spring wind and the lights were on in the front bay, and her daughter was waiting for her at the bottom of the porch steps with both arms open.